The blood hit the floor before anyone screamed. At 3:17 in the morning, four men with rifles walked through the emergency room doors of Riverside Medical Center, and the first thing they did was put a bullet in the ceiling. Not a warning shot, a statement. Plaster rained down on a waiting room full of people who had come in for broken bones and kidney stones and chest pain, and now they were on the floor with their hands over their heads, and the fluorescent lights were flickering because the shock had knocked something loose in the electrical panel. And in the middle of all of it, standing at the triage desk with a blood pressure cuff in her hand, was a 31-year-old night shift nurse named Emily Carter. The gunman closest to her turned, looked her over once, and dismissed her completely. That was the last mistake he would ever make. If you've made it this far, I need you to stay with me until the very end, because this story is about to go places you won't see coming. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. Bob. Riverside Medical Center was not the kind of hospital that made the news for good reasons. It sat on the eastern edge of Ashford City, a mid-sized Rust Belt town that had been slowly pulling itself back together for the better part of a decade. New downtown corridor, a revitalized waterfront, a tech park that was supposed to bring jobs but mostly brought traffic. The hospital was old. The parking garage had a crack running up the third level that maintenance kept patching over. The ER waiting room smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the specific kind of dread that settles into a place where people only show up when something has gone wrong. Emily Carter had worked the night shift there for 3 years. She was not remarkable to look at. Medium height, dark circles that no amount of sleep seemed to fully erase. Hair pulled back in a bun that was always coming loose by the second hour of her shift. She had the kind of quiet that some people mistook for shyness, and other people, the ones who paid attention, recognized as something else entirely. She kept to herself. She did her job. She ate lunch alone most nights in the break room, reading paperbacks she picked up from the hospital thrift cart, and she never talked about where she'd been before Ashford City. Nobody asked. That was the thing about night shift. Everyone was running from something, and the unspoken agreement was that you didn't dig. What her colleagues knew about Emily Carter: she had fast hands, a genuinely unnerving calm in a crisis, and an instinct for catching deteriorating patients before the monitors caught up. What they did not know: she had spent 6 years as an Army combat medic, 2 of those in forward operating bases in environments that most people with clearances didn't know existed. She had carried a rifle and saved lives under fire and made decisions in the dark that had no good options, and had done it all without flinching. And then one day she had walked into a recruiting office in Clarksburg, signed her separation papers, and driven west until Ashford City felt far enough from everything. 3 years. She had almost convinced herself it had worked. Then the men with guns walked in. There were 4 of them. Emily clocked this in the first 3 seconds. Not because she was trying to, but because her brain had been trained to do threat assessment the way other people's brains automatically tracked where the exits were in a new restaurant. 4 men. Military-style rifles, 2 of them, and 2 handguns. Tactical clothing, not uniforms. They moved with purpose, but not with the coordination of trained operators. There was a half-second delay between the leader's movements and the others following, which told her they were disciplined but not drilled. Experienced criminals, not soldiers. The leader was tall, rangy, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. He swept the room with his rifle and shouted, "Nobody move! Nobody touch a phone! We're looking for somebody, and once we find them, we're gone." 2 of his men fanned out along the perimeter. The 4th, the one closest to Emily, a stocky guy with his hat pulled low, grabbed the nearest person, which was a man in a wheelchair waiting for X-ray results, and put the barrel of his handgun against the man's temple. "Where's the trauma bay?" the leader demanded. Nobody answered. The waiting room had maybe 18 people in it. Patients, a couple of family members, a teenager on crutches who looked like he'd hurt himself playing basketball. They were all on the floor now, or flattening themselves against the walls, and the 2 nurses who had been at the admissions desk had ducked behind the counter. Emily had not moved. She was still standing at the triage station, the blood pressure cuff hanging from her hand, and she was doing the thing she had learned in the field, the thing that looked like freezing but wasn't. She was reading the room, calculating angles, Noting the positions of the men, the locations of the patients, the layout between here and the supply corridor that ran behind the triage bay, the stocky man with the gun noticed her. "Get down," he said. She looked at him, not defiant, not scared, just assessing. "I said get down." He took a step toward her. "Okay," Emily said, and she set the blood pressure cuff on the desk carefully, and she crouched down behind the triage station, and she kept her face empty. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead. The man they were looking for was in Trauma Bay 2. His name was apparently significant enough that 4 armed men had driven to a hospital in the middle of the night to either retrieve him or silence him, and Emily didn't know his name or what he'd done or which of those outcomes the men wanted. She just knew that Dr. Aaron Whitfield, the attending physician on overnight, had admitted a gunshot wound 2 hours ago under police hold, and that there was currently 1 patrol officer stationed outside Trauma Bay 2 who was completely alone and completely unprepared. She heard the shot from the corridor, a single crack, and then shouting, and then nothing good. Emily pressed herself against the wall of the supply corridor and closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Not to pray. To organize. She had a narrow hallway behind the triage bay, a supply closet 30 feet ahead, and a maintenance corridor that connected to the back of the ER if you knew which door to push. She had no weapon. She had a hospital, which meant she had a maze, and she had equipment, and she had the kind of knowledge that came from working in a building for 3 years. Which doors stuck, which hallways looped back on themselves, which supply rooms connected to which patient areas. She started moving. The stocky man, she was already thinking of him as number 4 because it helped to depersonalize. It was a trick she'd learned that her therapist in Clarksburg had called dissociation, and she'd called staying functional, had broken off from the group to sweep the corridor side of the ER. She heard his footsteps, the particular rhythm of someone moving with a gun out, and she was already inside the supply closet when he came around the corner. She waited. He pushed the door open. What happened next took about 4 seconds. Emily used the door itself, swinging it back hard into his gun arm, the satisfying crack of impact, the gun clattering, and then she was behind him with her forearm across his throat and 1 knee in his lower back, and she held on while he bucked and fought and then stopped fighting. She lowered him to the floor. Zip ties from the supply shelf. They kept them for wrist restraints on combative patients. She had his hands secured before her heart rate had gone above 90. She looked at him for a moment. He was breathing. She picked up his handgun, checked the chamber, and moved on. There was an orderly named Marcus Teal crouched inside the linen room adjacent to the main corridor, and he nearly had a heart attack when Emily eased the door open. He was maybe 22, 3rd month on the job, and he was doing the thing where you go so still you forget to breathe. "Hey," Emily said quietly. "It's me. It's Emily from triage." He stared at her. His eyes dropped to the gun in her hand and went very wide. How did you? "I need you to stay in here with the door locked," she said. "Don't open it for anyone. If you have a phone, call 911 now if you haven't already. Tell them 4 armed intruders, 1 officer down. Active situation. You got that?" "1 officer," his voice cracked. "Is he?" "I don't know yet. Call it in. Stay here." She looked at him directly, the way you looked at someone when you needed them to hold together. "You're going to be okay, but I need you to stay put." Marcus nodded. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands. Emily closed the door and moved. She found the 2nd man in the corridor outside the radiology suite. He was older, gray at the temples, and he was moving systematically, checking rooms, which told her he had done this kind of thing before. He had a rifle, and he was holding it properly, and she did not have the angle or the element of surprise that she'd had with number 4. She had a problem. She solved it with a rolling IV pole and a fire extinguisher. The extinguisher was not to hit him with, though it was heavy enough, and she held that option. It was for the CO2 discharge, which she triggered in his direction from 15 feet away, the chemical fog filling the corridor, and in the 2 seconds he lost, hand up, head turned away, she closed the distance and used the IV pole and his own disorientation to take him down. He hit the wall hard. She hit him harder. He slumped. Her hands were shaking slightly when she zip-tied him. She noticed the shaking, filed it away. Not now. That left two. The leader with the scar, she was calling him one, and a third man she hadn't had eyes on yet. Three was the variable. Three could be anywhere. She had taken out 2 and 4. She had a handgun with 8 rounds remaining. She was in a hospital at 3:30 in the morning with civilians scattered through the corridors and 2 active shooters who by now had to know something had gone wrong with their team. She moved toward the trauma bay. The patrol officer, his name was on his badge, Hendricks, was down in the corridor outside. She checked him fast. Alive. Unconscious. Head wound. Bad but not immediately fatal. She rolled him into the recovery position, flagged his location mentally. She would come back. Through the glass panel of Trauma Bay 2, she could see their target, the gunshot patient, still connected to monitors, sedated, and she could see that 1 and 3 had found him. 3 was watching the door. 1 was on his phone. She pulled back around the corner. She needed to think. The problem with the Trauma Bay was the glass. The moment she appeared in that corridor, 3 would see her. 1 would see her. She had a handgun and no cover and 2 men with rifles between her and the patient, and if this turned into a firefight in a trauma bay, the patient died and probably she did too. She needed them to come out. She found the intercom panel for the trauma bay 40 feet back down the corridor near the nurses' station. It was a simple system. You could open a channel from the nurses' station to any bay, a relic of the old layout that nobody had bothered to modernize because the overhead paging was faster. Emily crouched below the counter, lifted the handset, and hit the channel for Trauma Bay 2. Static. Then she could hear them through the speaker. Not responding. One's voice, clipped, impatient. He's sedated. We need to move him. We can't move him. He's got tubes. Then pull the tubes. A pause. If we pull the tubes, he dies. That's acceptable. Emily pressed the transmit button and said, no, it isn't. Silence on the other end. Then, who is that? Someone who's been counting your team, Emily said. You came in with 4, you're down to 2. I'd think carefully about what happens next. She heard 3 say something she couldn't make out. One's voice returned, quieter now, tighter. You're bluffing. Your man in the supply corridor is zip-tied to a shelf. The one in radiology is zip-tied to a wheelchair I borrowed from the waiting room. They're both alive, which is more than you've given me any reason to do. Another pause. She could hear the texture of it, the recalculation, the anger, the thing underneath the anger that she recognized because she had heard it before, in other corridors, in other bad situations. The first note of doubt. Step out where I can see you, one said. No. Then this patient stops breathing in 30 seconds. Emily said nothing. She was already moving. Away from the intercom, back up the corridor, taking a different angle. She had needed 30 seconds herself. She had them now. What happened next she would later be unable to fully account for in the sequence that made sense to other people. Later, when she tried to explain it to the investigators, she kept losing the thread of chronology, because in those situations, time didn't move the way it moved in normal life. It compressed and expanded, and you did things without fully consciously deciding to do them, your body executing a sequence that your training had drilled in deep enough to become instinct. What she knew. 3 came out of the trauma bay because 1 sent him to find her, and he came out the wrong side, and she was waiting in the gap between the medication dispensary and the wall, and she had enough surprise and enough angle, and 3's weapon was pointed at the floor when he rounded the corner. What she knew, he was bigger than her and stronger, and the next 30 seconds were ugly and involved a collision with a crash cart and a laceration on her forearm that she would not notice until much later. What she knew, when it was over, 3 was not getting up. She stood in the corridor breathing hard. Her forearm was bleeding. She pressed her sleeve against it without really registering it and picked up 3's rifle, which she understood better than the handgun, and she moved to the trauma bay. 1 was standing in the center of the room with his rifle aimed at the sedated patient on the table. Put it down, he said, or he's dead. Emily stopped in the doorway. She had the rifle up. He had the rifle up. The patient was between them, unconscious, connected to 3 different monitors that were all currently alarming. She looked at 1, specifically at his hands, specifically at the way his grip had changed since she'd heard him on the intercom. Fingers tighter, jaw muscle jumping, a slight tremor in the left hand that hadn't been there when he'd walked into her ER. He was scared. She said, "You're holding that wrong." He blinked. "What?" "Your left hand, you're too far forward on the grip, means you're compensating for the shake." She kept her voice flat, informational. "You've been in firefights before, but not often. You know how to use the gun, but your body doesn't know how to absorb the stress. That's a training deficit." "Shut up. You came here for a reason. Your target is sedated and monitored, and if you kill him right now, whatever reason you came for dies with him. So think about what you actually need." One stared at her. Something shifted in his face, not softening, but reorganizing. He was trying to recalculate, and he was running out of data to calculate with, because the situation had stopped making sense somewhere in the last 20 minutes. "Who the hell are you?" he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Emily kept the rifle steady. "A nurse," she said. The sound of rotors reached them at 4:02 a.m. It started as a vibration in the window glass, barely perceptible, and then it became a sound, a deep rhythmic thud that Emily recognized before her conscious brain had processed it, and something in her chest responded to it in a way she did not have a clean word for. Not relief. Something older. One heard it too. She watched his eyes cut to the window. The lights hit first, and two sharp white beams sweeping the hospital roof and the parking lot below, and then a second source, and a third. And the radio on 3's belt, which Emily had tucked into her waistband, crackled and went to a new frequency, and a voice said, "All units, we have a federal perimeter established at Riverside Medical Center. All building exits are covered. This is a federal operation. Stand down immediately." One lowered his rifle by about 3 inches, involuntary. He caught himself and brought it back up, but the damage was done. Emily had seen it the moment his certainty cracked. "That's for you," she said. "Not for me." One looked at her and she could see him doing the arithmetic, the final version of it, and the answer kept coming back the same no matter how he ran it. His team was down. The building was surrounded. The woman in the doorway had a rifle, and she had already demonstrated, at considerable personal cost, that she would use it. He was still holding the rifle on the patient when the Federal Tactical Unit came through the ER doors. They came through fast and quiet, two-man stacks, the particular controlled urgency of people who had done this hundreds of times, and they swept the corridors in sequence, and when they reached the trauma bay, Emily was still in the doorway with her rifle up, and one was still in the center of the room with his rifle on the patient. And for a moment, everyone was very still. Then the team leader said, in a voice that carried its own kind of authority, "Emily, we've got him." One turned his head toward the team. Emily used the motion, crossed the room in 3 steps, grabbed the barrel of his rifle, twisted it upward, and drove her shoulder into his chest. He went back against the wall hard. The rifle came free. She stepped back, and the federal team was already moving around her, and one went down under a pile of tactical gear and zip ties that made her own work look amateurish. She lowered her rifle. Her hands, she noticed, had finally stopped shaking. The next several minutes were controlled chaos that Emily moved through as if she were watching it from some distance slightly above and to the left of her body. She showed the tactical team where she'd secured 2 and 4. She brought them to Hendricks, still down in the corridor outside the trauma bay, and watched a paramedic team work on him with the automatic assessment of someone cataloging errors and non-errors. She stood at the edge of the nurses' station while people in body armor swept back and forth around her and gave a preliminary accounting to a federal agent with a tablet who kept looking at her the way people looked at math that didn't add up. "You secured 2 of them yourself," the agent said. "Yes. With zip ties. From supply. We use them for—" "I know what you use them for." He looked at her arm, at the sleeve she had pressed against the laceration. "You need that looked at." "In a minute. Carter." He said her name with the particular weight of someone who already knew more than they were showing. "We need to talk. But not here." He looked around the corridor. The ER staff beginning to emerge from hiding, patients being moved, the fluorescent overhead finally stabilizing after the initial flicker. "Somewhere quieter." Emily looked at him. "There's a family consultation room at the end of the hall," she said. "Second door on the left. Nobody uses it at night." She turned and walked toward it without waiting to see if he followed. Behind her, through the cracked open trauma bay door, she heard one of the federal agents say something into a radio, and she heard the response, distant, crackly, carrying through the radio static. And the word she heard just before the door swung closed behind her made something cold move through her chest. The federal agent on the radio had said her full name. Not Emily Carter. The other name. The name she had stopped using 3 years ago. The name that belonged to a file she had been told would never surface. The name they'd used on that radio was Calloway. Sergeant First Class Emily Calloway, formerly of the 75th Support Battalion's Forward Medical Element, attached for 2 years to a unit whose designation appeared in no publicly accessible records. She had filed her separation paperwork under Carter, her mother's maiden name, the name on her birth certificate before her father had claimed her at age 7. And she had done it deliberately, carefully, with the help of a JAG officer named Stein, who had understood without being told why a woman leaving that kind of service might want a clean break from the name the Army had built a file around. That file was supposed to be sealed. She sat in the family consultation room and looked at the surface of the table and waited for the federal agent to come through the door. The room smelled like old Kleenex and the particular sadness of spaces designed for delivering bad news. Someone had left a paper cup half full of cold coffee on the windowsill. Emily stared at it. The agent came in 30 seconds later. He pulled the door closed behind him, and he sat down across from her without the tablet this time, which told her something. He was in his mid-40s, compact, with the kind of economy of movement that came from years of physical discipline and the kind of face that had stopped being easy to read sometime around his 3rd decade. He set both hands flat on the table. "My name is Garfield," he said. "Special Agent Darnell Garfield, DHS Investigations. I've been running a surveillance operation on the network your shooters tonight belong to for 11 months. Emily said nothing. "The man in Trauma Bay 2, the gunshot patient your hospital admitted under police hold. His name is Victor Osei. He's a logistics coordinator for that network. He came in because one of his own people shot him during an internal dispute 2 nights ago." Garfield paused. "The 4 men who came in tonight were trying to make sure Osei didn't talk before we got to him. They were also trying to retrieve an encrypted drive that Osei had on him when he was brought in." "Did they get it?" "No, your patrol officer had the presence of mind to secure it as evidence before he lost consciousness. It's in federal custody now." Garfield looked at her steadily. "You want to tell me how a night shift nurse managed to neutralize 2 armed men with zip ties and a fire extinguisher?" "CO2 discharge," Emily said. "The extinguisher. Not the fire suppression kind." Garfield waited. "I had training," she said. "I know what training you had." He said it without inflection, without accusation, just a statement of fact that sat on the table between them like something solid. "Emily Calloway. 2 tours, the second one with a unit I technically don't have clearance to know the name of, though I've heard it anyway because that's how this business works. Medical specialist with a secondary evaluation for tactical operations. Separated 4 years ago. Came to Ashford City about 6 months after that." He paused. "You've been filling out payroll paperwork with a different name for 3 years. "Carter is my legal name. It's on my license." "I know. I'm not here about the name." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm here because you just saved 11 people's lives and incapacitated 2 federal targets without lethal force, and I need to understand what happened tonight before the story gets built for me by someone who wasn't in the building." Emily looked at her hands. The laceration on her forearm had soaked through the sleeve she'd pressed against it, a slow spread of red that she noted clinically. She needed to clean and close that, later. "There were 4 men," she said. "I identified the threat. I used what was available." She glanced up. "That's what happened." "That's a summary." Garfield's voice was even. "I need the version with details." She gave it to him. She was precise, and she was brief, and she did not editorialize, and she gave him the sequence in the order it had happened, and while she talked, she watched him take notes on nothing. No tablet, no notepad, which meant he was recording, which she had assumed from the moment he'd said her other name. She was careful about what she said, and more careful about what she didn't. When she finished, Garfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been working nights here?" 3 years in January. "Before tonight, had anyone here, staff, administration, Had any indication of your background? Emily thought about this honestly. No. Not the director? Not the attending physicians? I told HR I had prior military service in my application. Didn't specify the branch or the role. She paused. Nobody asked. Garfield nodded slowly, something moving behind his expression that she couldn't fully read. They're about to, he said. The ER looked different when she walked back into it at 4:20. The patients who could be moved had been moved. Non-critical cases relocated to the lobby or the second-floor waiting area. The corridors cleared for the federal team still conducting sweep and documentation. The overhead lights had been fully restored. Someone had cleaned the plaster off the waiting room floor, or started to. There were still white chunks near the far wall where the ceiling had taken the bullet. The admissions desk had a federal agent standing behind it. Everything smelled like gun residue and antiseptic and the aftermath of adrenaline. Dr. Aaron Whitfield was standing in the middle of the corridor with his arms crossed, talking to two police officers. He saw Emily and something passed through his face. Something complicated. Some emotion that he either couldn't identify or wasn't ready to express. And it came out looking like anger because that was the shape it fit best in his particular emotional vocabulary. Whitfield was 48, senior attending, the kind of doctor who had been excellent for long enough that he had stopped noticing when he was being difficult. He had a habit of shortcutting his nurses in front of patients, correcting their assessments publicly in ways that were sometimes warranted and sometimes not, and Emily had spent 18 months learning to work around him rather than against him, not because she was afraid of him, because it wasn't worth the energy. Carter, he said, breaking off from the officers. Where have you been? I've been trying to account for all staff. I was with Agent Garfield, she said, giving a statement. He looked at her arm, at the bloodied sleeve. What happened to you? One of them and I had a disagreement. Whitfield's mouth opened and closed. The police officers were watching. He said, I heard. Somebody told me you were in the corridors during that you had a weapon. I took it from one of them, she said. I gave it to the federal team. You were in the corridors, he said again, louder now, as if the repetition would resolve the wrongness of it. Emily, you're a nurse. You were supposed to shelter in place. You were supposed to... There are protocols. The protocols assume someone calls 911 and the police arrive before 2 of the 4 gunmen have swept half the building, she said. The timeline didn't support shelter in place. Whitfield stared at her. She watched him trying to reconcile what he was hearing with the person he had filed her as in his mental ledger. The quiet night shift nurse, competent enough, invisible enough, never worth more than 3 seconds of attention when the attendings were making rounds. The ledger wasn't updating fast enough. You could have been killed, he said finally. Yes, Emily said. So could everyone else. She moved past him toward the supply corridor to get something for her arm. The laceration was 4 centimeters, deep enough to need closure, but not deep enough for the OR. She cleaned it herself in the supply room, which was not protocol, and she knew it, but the idea of sitting in a bay waiting for someone to stitch her up while the rest of the night unraveled around her was not something she could manage. She irrigated the wound, applied steri strips with the methodical care of someone who had closed worse and worse conditions, wrapped it in gauze, and stood in front of the supply shelf for a moment, letting the discomfort fully register because sometimes you needed to let the body know it had happened. Her hands were steady. She was grateful for that, and then immediately suspicious of the gratitude. Steadiness right now might be the last remnant of operational adrenaline, and the shaking would come later, in the parking lot maybe, or driving home, or in the shower, or at 3 a.m, 3 weeks from now. That was usually how it worked. She had been through the debrief cycle before. Marcus Teal found her in the supply corridor just before 5 a.m. He had the particular look of someone who had been crying and then stopped and was now holding everything just barely level. He was still carrying his phone. I called, he said. What you said to do? I called right away. Good, Emily said. That helped. I heard what happened, from one of the paramedics. He paused. They're saying you took out 2 of them, by yourself. She didn't respond to that directly. Is Officer Hendricks okay? They took him to surgery. They think he'll be okay. Marcus hesitated. Emily, who are you? She looked at him. He was asking the honest version of the question, not the threatening version, not the suspicious version, just the bewildered version of someone trying to update their understanding of the world. I used to be someone different, she said. I'm trying to be this now. He nodded slowly, like that made a kind of sense to him, even if he couldn't fully articulate why. She handed him a box of nitrile gloves from the shelf and said, Bay 4 is going to need restocking once the federal team clears it. Can you start the supply list? He looked at the gloves. Then he almost laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. And he took the gloves, because giving someone a task was the most useful thing you could do with shock, and Emily had learned that a long time ago. The sun came up at 6:47. Emily knew this because she was in the parking lot when it happened, sitting on the concrete barrier near the ambulance bay, because she had needed air, and the air inside the hospital had started to feel like something she was breathing rather than something she was exchanging with the world. She had her jacket on, the hood up, her hands loose in her lap. The light hit the glass face of the parking garage and bounced back warm and orange and entirely indifferent to what had happened inside the building behind her. And Emily looked at it and felt the particular exhaustion that came not from the body, but from the long effort of being a specific kind of person in a world that had no easy category for it. She heard the door open behind her and didn't turn around. Carter! A different voice than Garfield. Female, clipped, with the trace of a regional accent she couldn't immediately place. You can't be out here alone. Emily turned then. The woman was in her mid-30s, in tactical clothing, with a military bearing that Emily recognized the way you recognized a particular language being spoken. Not the words, just the cadence. She had dark hair cut short and a scar along her jaw that had been there long enough to fade to silver. Who are you? Emily said. Major Helena Voss, JAG liaison, attached to the federal task force running the OSE operation. She paused. I've been reading your file. My file is sealed. Your Army file is sealed, Voss said. Your federal contractor file is a different thing. Emily looked at her. I don't have a federal contractor file. Voss sat down on the concrete barrier about 4 feet away, which was a choice. She could have remained standing, which would have been the power position, but she sat down, which either meant she was good at disarming people or she was genuinely trying not to make this feel like a confrontation. You did, Voss said. Past tense on one piece of it, but some threads don't close as cleanly as the paperwork says they do. She looked at the parking garage, at the morning light. What I'm about to tell you is going to require some context. Give me the short version first, Emily said, then the context. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Victor Ose is not just a logistics coordinator. He's a protected asset. He was cooperating with our investigation before he was shot, and the information he has implicates people at levels that make this more complicated than a standard criminal case. She paused. One of those people has a connection to your service record. Emily's chest went still. What connection? She said. The unit you were attached to in your second tour, the one with the restricted designation. Voss said it carefully, evenly. The network your shooters belong to tonight. It has a financial source. That source has been protected for a long time. Part of the reason it's been protected is that it has leverage, information, records, things that were supposed to stay buried, over certain people who are now in positions where they'd prefer the leverage never saw daylight. Emily said nothing. She was doing the thing again, the reading, the calculating, but now she was reading something vast and poorly lit, and she couldn't see all the edges. My record, she said, your commendation files, the after-action reports from your second tour, some of that documentation, if it surfaced in the wrong context, would raise questions about decisions made above your rank that were signed off on with your name on the incident logs. Voss said it flat and direct, no cushion in it. You were following orders. That's documented. But the questions would still be raised, and the people who made those decisions would let the questions land on you first while they arranged their exits. The morning light was getting stronger. Emily looked at her hands. Ose has this information, she said. Among other things, yes. And the people who sent 4 gunmen into my ER tonight want that drive back before Ose talks to anyone. Voss nodded. The drive your patrol officer secured, the one currently in federal custody. It's not just operational data on the network. It has documentation of the arrangement, including names. She paused. Including names that would reopen questions about your tour. Emily stood up from the concrete barrier. Not urgently, just standing, because she needed the ground under her feet to be something she had chosen. So I walked into a situation tonight, she said slowly, that was already about me. You walked into a situation that was adjacent to a larger situation that has been about you, among other things, for approximately 3 years. Voss looked up at her. Since around when you arrived in Ashford City. The quiet between them stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. Who else knows this? Emily said. On the federal team, Garfield and 2 others. My supervisor, who I trust because I have verified reasons to trust him, and whoever has been monitoring the situation on the other side. Voss paused. Which is the part I need you to understand, and it's the part that requires the context I mentioned. Emily looked at her. Tell me. And she got the context in pieces over the next 40 minutes, sitting back down on the barrier while the hospital behind them came alive with morning shift arrivals who found their parking lot full of federal vehicles and their ER taped off, and their colleagues coming out through the side doors in various states of shock. Emily registered all of this peripherally and kept her attention on Voss. The network was called, in the federal case files, the Larson Group, after the man who had founded it, a former defense contractor named Theodore Larson, who had retired in the official sense 11 years ago and continued operating in the unofficial sense ever since. The group had 3 primary functions: moving money across jurisdictions for clients who needed it, moved without questions, providing security and enforcement services to those same clients, and occasionally, when needed, making problems disappear. The 4 men who had come into Riverside Medical Center tonight were from the enforcement side. Larson had a federal problem that had been building for 4 years, which was how long Garfield's team had been watching him. Osei had been their inside position for 11 months. 3 weeks ago, someone inside the federal operation had leaked to Larson that Osei was cooperating. 2 nights ago, Osei was shot. Tonight was the cleanup. The connection to Emily's service record was through a man named Brandt, Colonel Raymond Brandt, retired, who had commanded the restricted unit Emily had been attached to, and who had, in the last 4 years, become one of the Larson Group's most valuable clients. Brandt had classified operations in his past that he needed to stay classified. Not because they were state secrets, but because they were crimes dressed in the uniform of state secrets. And Larson had been providing the protection. The documentation on Osei's drive included records of payments from Brandt to Larson going back 6 years, alongside redacted incident reports from Brandt's command that, if fully unredacted, would connect Brandt to decisions that had cost soldiers their lives and lined his retirement fund. Emily's name appeared in those reports because she had been the medical specialist on 3 of those operations. She had documented what she saw. She had filed accurate after-action medical assessments. She had not at the time fully understood what she was documenting because the tactical context above her clearance level had been deliberately obscured. But her reports were there, and they were accurate, and if they surfaced alongside Brandt's files, they would either exonerate her completely or be used as a smokescreen by people trying to muddy the accountability. Brandt knows your name, Voss said. He's known you were in Ashford City for at least 2 years. Emily heard this and let it settle in whatever place the worst information went. He's been watching me, she said, monitoring. There's a distinction, legally. Not to me. Voss conceded this with a small dip of her head. He's been making sure you stayed quiet. His assessment, from what we've intercepted, was that you were contained, that you'd left, you'd moved on. You had no interest in surfacing anything. I didn't, Emily said. I don't. What you wanted doesn't change what he thinks you might do. Voss looked at her evenly. Brandt learned about tonight approximately 2 hours ago. We intercepted a communication, encrypted, but our team broke it, in which he referred to the situation here and mentioned your name. He described tonight as a complication. Emily was quiet for a long moment. In the parking lot, a blue sedan pulled in and a woman in scrubs got out, checked her phone, looked at the federal vehicles, and slowly turned around and got back in her car. The small absurdities of other people's days continuing. He's coming here, Emily said. Not a question. We believe so. Or he's sending someone to manage the situation. Voss paused. You were a loose thread before tonight. After tonight, you're something else. What am I now? Voss looked at her with a directness that Emily recognized as a kind of respect. The particular respect of one person in a hard situation acknowledging another person in a harder one. Your evidence, Voss said. Oh. She went back inside because there was work to do, and working was how she managed the parts of her brain that wanted to run a threat assessment on every car in the parking lot. The morning shift had been held at the entrance, a decision by Garfield's team, which had created a bottleneck situation near the main lobby where approximately 30 medical staff were crowded with their ID badges out, murmuring at each other and checking their phones. Emily came through the side entrance on her badge and walked the ER corridor, which was quieter now, the federal team having consolidated in the trauma bay area and the main ER beginning, tentatively, to return to something like function. Hendricks, she learned from a surgery resident named Park, had come out of the OR. The head injury was serious, but the bleed was controlled. He'd be in ICU for at least a week, but he was stable. Emily noted this and felt something release very slightly in her chest. The 4 shooters were in federal custody, processed out of the hospital at around 5:30. She hadn't seen them go. She was mildly glad about this. Whitfield was in the physician's lounge when she passed it, sitting alone with a mug of coffee going cold in front of him. He looked up when she passed the window, and she could see him doing the reconciliation again, the ledger updating, and she didn't stop. She didn't have the energy for his version of the story right now. What she had not anticipated was the administrator. Richard Holt was the director of hospital operations for Riverside Medical Center, a title that meant he controlled the budget, staffing levels, and the particular brand of institutional condescension that filtered down through middle management and pooled in places like the night shift nursing station. Emily had 3 documented interactions with Holt, one during her initial onboarding, one when she had filed a formal complaint about staffing levels in the overnight ER that had been acknowledged with a form letter, and one 4 months ago when Holt had appeared at a nursing staff meeting to explain, with the careful phrasing of someone who had practiced it, that the hospital was implementing a performance review process that would, in the interest of efficiency, evaluate overnight nursing staff on metrics that Emily had later identified as being specifically designed to cull the most expensive senior nurses. She had not heard the outcome of that process. She had been trying not to think about it too carefully. Holt was standing in the main corridor now, talking to someone on his phone, and he saw Emily and held up a finger, the gesture of a man who assumed everyone around him was waiting for his attention. Emily stopped. Not because of the finger, because he had moved to block the corridor. He finished the call and looked at her with the expression of someone managing a situation. Carter, he said, I've been trying to reach the night shift staff. I need a full account of your movements tonight for the hospital's liability review. She looked at him. I gave a statement to Agent Garfield. That's a federal statement. I need a hospital statement. There are protocols you may have violated, going into restricted areas, handling weapons, engaging with the men who came into your emergency room with rifles, Emily said. Her voice came out very level. She noticed this and noted it as a good sign. I'm not disputing that the situation was serious, Holt said, managing. What I'm saying is that there are legal implications for the hospital when an employee takes unilateral action outside their Mr. Holt. She kept her voice the same temperature. 3 of your night shift staff are in that family consultation room right now being treated for shock. Your patrol officer is in the ICU. 2 federal targets are in federal custody because of what happened in this building tonight. The liability review can happen whenever you need it to happen. I'll be available. She met his eyes. After I've slept. She moved past him. He said, This isn't over, Carter. She did not stop walking. But the conversation she had not been prepared for happened at 7:15 in the small kitchenette off the nurse's station, where she had gone to drink something hot that wasn't terrible, which was an aspiration the hospital coffee consistently failed to meet. The charge nurse for day shift was a woman named Barbara Okonkwo, 53, who had been at Riverside Medical for 17 years, and who had the kind of authority that didn't come from a title, but from the specific gravity of someone who had outlasted every administrative reorganization the hospital had attempted. She had been Emily's de facto supervisor on nights. Not officially, just in the way that competent, experienced people become the actual operating structure beneath the official one. Barbara came into the kitchenette and looked at Emily's arm. "How bad?" she said. "Managed," Emily said. Barbara poured herself coffee and stood with her back against the counter and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who was choosing their words. "I've worked nights," Barbara said. "I've worked nights for 11 years before I moved to days. In those 11 years, I have sheltered in place during one active threat, and I have seen 2 colleagues injured during incidents in this ER." She paused. "I have never in 17 years seen what I saw on those corridor cameras." Emily said nothing. "The federal people are asking staff if they saw you, what you did. They're collecting accounts." Barbara looked at her directly. "There are going to be a lot of accounts." "I know." "People are scared," Barbara said. "Not of you, of the situation." She paused. "Some of them are asking questions about who you are, about why you knew how to do what you did." "They'll get answers," Emily said. "Soon, I think." Barbara nodded, slow and deliberate, and Emily could see her processing the answer, the specificity of it, the steadiness of it, the absence of the kind of deflection people gave when they were surprised by the question. "Were you always—" Barbara started, and then stopped, and then tried again. "Did you always know this was in you?" Emily thought about this honestly. "Not in me," she said finally. "In my training, there's a difference." She looked at the coffee in her hand. "I've spent 3 years trying to make the difference bigger." Barbara was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Well, it's a damn good thing the training won tonight." She left Emily with the coffee on deck. At 7:58, Emily's phone buzzed. It was an Ashford City number she didn't recognize, and she almost let it go to voicemail. And then something, the timing, the morning, the general atmosphere of the night unraveling in directions she couldn't fully predict, made her answer. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the flat effect of someone who had been briefed on managing their presentation. "Ms. Carter," it said. "My name is Robert Calloway. I'm calling on behalf of a client who has an interest in the situation at Riverside Medical Center this morning." A pause. "My client would like to speak with you directly. He believes there may be a misunderstanding that can be resolved without further escalation." Emily sat very still. She said, "What's your client's name?" "I'm not authorized to—" "What's your client's name?" she said again. A pause that was 2 seconds too long. "Colonel Brandt," the voice said. "He'd like to meet this afternoon, somewhere private." Another pause. "He says to tell you he has always respected your service and that the matters at issue tonight are more complicated than they appear. He wants to be transparent with you." Emily looked at the window of the kitchenette. Outside, the parking lot was still full of federal vehicles, the morning light hard and clear on everything. "Tell your client," she said carefully, "that I need a few hours." "Of course." "Tell him I'll think about it." She ended the call. She sat still for exactly 30 seconds, which was how long she allowed herself before she stood up and walked back to the family consultation room where Agent Garfield was still working and knocked twice on the door and said, when he opened it, "I just got a call from Raymond Brandt." Garfield's expression did something she hadn't seen it do yet, in all the hours since this began. He looked worried. "He wants a private meeting," Emily said. "This afternoon." But Garfield stared at her. "You didn't agree? I told him I'd think about it." She kept her voice steady. "But here's what you need to know." She paused, giving it weight. "He called me Carter." Garfield blinked. "What?" "Not Calloway. Carter." She looked at him. "He used the name I've been using here, not the name in my army file." And she watched Garfield understand what that meant, that Brandt had not just been monitoring her from a distance, not just tracking a sealed file. He had someone inside, someone who knew her current name, her current location, her current life. Someone who had been watching from close enough to use the right name. The question that followed that was the one that landed in the space between them and sat there, heavy and unresolved. If Brandt had a source close enough to know the name Emily Carter, who inside Riverside Medical Center had been feeding him information for 3 years? Garfield closed the consultation room door and stood with his back against it for a moment, which was the first time Emily had seen him need a wall behind him. "Walk me through exactly what he said," Garfield said, word for word. She did. She had a good memory. Not photographic, but trained, the way you learn to retain briefings when you couldn't write things down. She gave him the call in sequence, the phrasing, the pauses, the 2 seconds of silence before the name Brandt. Garfield listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "He called you Carter." "Yes." "Not Calloway, not Sergeant, Carter." "That's what I said." He pushed off the wall and moved to the table, not sitting, just standing at it, and Emily could see him running through his team in the particular way of someone who had trusted a structure and was now testing every joint in it. "How many people inside this hospital know your prior service?" he said. "My application said prior military. No branch, no MOS, no unit. I never discussed it with anyone here." She paused. "The only people who would have access to the name Calloway through official channels are whoever pulled my sealed Army file, which requires clearance, or whoever Brandt already told." "Or whoever Brandt has watching you here," Garfield said. "Yes." He pulled out his phone and stepped to the corner of the room, and she listened to him have a short, clipped conversation with someone on his team. She caught the words internal audit and access logs and get me the visitor registry for the last 6 months. And when he came back, he looked at her with a directness that was different from earlier. "I need you to stay in the building," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. I mean, specifically, don't go anywhere alone. Don't take any more calls from that number." He paused. "And I need you to think. Everyone who has had regular access to your personnel file here, anyone who has shown unusual interest in your background, any interaction that felt off." He said it carefully, knowing how it sounded. "I know that's asking you to look at people you work with." Emily looked at the table. She thought about 3 years of night shifts, the specific texture of who had asked what, who had been curious in the normal way and who had been curious in a different way that she had noticed at the time and filed away and not returned to because there had been no reason to return to it. There was a reason now. She thought about Richard Holt. She thought about the performance review process 4 months ago, the one designed to evaluate overnight nurses on metrics that would have targeted senior staff. She thought about who benefits from having the night shift ER understaffed, from having experienced nurses replaced with cheaper ones, from having the kind of institutional attrition that meant fewer people paying close attention to who came through the ER at what hours. She thought about the man Osei, the logistics coordinator, shot by his own people 2 nights ago, brought into Riverside specifically. Not Mercy General on the north side, not St. Agatha's downtown. Riverside. The hospital on the eastern edge of the city, with the understaffed night shift and the cracked parking garage, and the patrol officer posted alone outside the trauma bay. "Holt," she said. Garfield looked at her. "Richard Holt, hospital operations director." She kept her voice measured because she was not certain, and uncertainty deserved its own kind of precision. "He's been running a staffing restructure that makes no operational sense for patient outcomes, but makes a lot of sense if you wanted to ensure a specific kind of access and a specific kind of reduced oversight during overnight hours." She paused. "And 4 months ago, he had a visitor. I saw them in the administrative corridor. A man I didn't recognize, private clothes, not medical staff, not a vendor. They went into Holt's office, and the door was closed for an hour." She looked at Garfield. "I noticed because it was 11 at night and Holt doesn't work nights." Garfield was already on his phone again.
But it was months."
What followed was not dramatic in the way the earlier hours had been dramatic. It was worse, in some ways. The slow burn of a situation that had moved from crisis into something more deliberate and more patient. Garfield's team pulled the hospital's visitor registry and access logs. Emily sat in the consultation room and wrote out, on a legal pad someone produced from somewhere, every anomalous interaction she could recall over 3 years. The small things, the off-note moments, the administrative decisions that had felt like friction without a visible source. It took 40 minutes. She filled 4 pages. She was on the 3rd page when Garfield came back in and said, without preamble, Holt met with a man named Devin Marsh 9 times over the past 18 months. Marsh is on our known associates list for the Larson Group, logistics and placement. Emily set down the pen. He was placing people, she said. We think so. Using hospital administrative access to monitor patient intake, flag specific admissions, manage which staff were on shift during certain windows. Garfield paused. We think Osei was brought to Riverside 2 nights ago because Marsh had already confirmed the overnight staffing and the patrol coverage. They expected a soft target. And they knew I was here, Emily said. They knew a nurse named Emily Carter was here. We don't think they connected Carter to Calloway until tonight. He paused. Which means when Brant called you this morning using the name Carter, he had gotten that information from Holt or Marsh in the last few hours, after the situation resolved. Emily thought about what that meant. Brant learning what had happened, getting the name, making the call, the speed of it, the reach of it. Where's Holt now? She said. We're looking. She looked at him. He's not in the building, Garfield said. He left approximately 40 minutes ago. We have him on the parking lot cameras. He took a call, went to his car, and drove west. He said it with the specific flatness of someone managing their own frustration. We have units on it. 40 minutes ago. While Emily had been in the kitchenette, while she had been talking to Barbara about training and the difference it made, while Brant's man had been watching from somewhere inside and sending the update. The escalation when it came did not come through the front door. It came at 9:47 in the morning through Victor Osei. He had come out of sedation, not all the way, not clean, the kind of partial surfacing that happened when the body decided it had been under long enough and started fighting back toward consciousness, whether the brain was ready or not. The trauma bay nurse, a day shift veteran named Torres, paged the attending and then paged again when Osei's monitors started alarming in a pattern that wasn't the sedation wearing off. His pressure was dropping. His heart rate was climbing in the specific dysrhythmic pattern that Emily, passing the bay on her way to get the legal pad copied, recognized from the doorway before Torres had fully processed what she was seeing. He's bleeding, Emily said. She was inside the bay before she had consciously decided to move. Torres looked at her. Carter, you're off shift. Get doctor Whitfield and get a crash cart and page vascular surgery. She was already at the bedside, hands on Osei's abdomen, palpating, feeling the rigidity of internal bleeding building under pressure. His surgical repair from 2 nights ago is failing. He's got an abdominal bleed. She looked at Torres directly. Now. Torres paged. Whitfield came in 90 seconds later at a controlled run, took one look at the monitors, and moved to the opposite side of the bed from Emily without a word. He did the same palpation she had done, and his jaw tightened. He said, now. Who's the vascular on call? Paged, Torres said. Tell them 10 minutes. He looked across the bed at Emily. Something moved through his expression that was not the managing look and not the correcting look. It was the look of a doctor who needed another competent person in his OR and was rapidly revising his available options. You're still here, he said. I'm still here, she said. Scrub in. It was not a question and not really an offer. It was a doctor in the middle of a patient crisis using what was in front of him, and Emily scrubbed in because Osei was the evidence and the asset and the man who had been shot by his own people for talking, and she was going to make sure he survived long enough to do it. The surgery took 2 hours and 14 minutes. The repair that had been done 2 nights ago, at a different hospital, she learned, by a surgeon who had operated under pressure in a trauma situation, had held for 48 hours and then begun to fail at the anastomosis site, a small leak that had become a slow bleed that had become an emergency. Vascular surgery arrived 7 minutes in, which was fast, and between the 3 of them they controlled the bleed and repaired the site, and Osei went back to stable in the way that felt earned rather than lucky. Emily was at the scrub sink when Whitfield came up beside her. They stood at adjacent sinks for a moment without speaking. You saw it from the doorway, Whitfield said. Not accusing, not complimenting, trying to understand. The rhythm, she said. Internal pressure bleed has a pattern. You learn it. In nursing school, he said carefully. In the field, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Which field? She looked at her hands under the water. The kind where, if you don't catch it fast, the person doesn't have time to wait for a surgeon. Whitfield rinsed his hands and stood there, and she could feel him doing the full revision. Not just the ledger updating, but the larger reassessment of 3 years of working with someone he had never really seen. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Probably several." "You can put it somewhere useful," she said. "Not cruel, just honest. There's a patient in recovery who needs clean charting and a clear handoff brief for the next attending. That's where I'd put it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded and left. Garfield was waiting outside the OR corridor. "Osei is stable," Emily said before he could ask. "He'll be able to talk, maybe this evening, maybe tomorrow. Depends on how he comes out of anesthesia." Good. But his face wasn't carrying good news, and she saw this. "What happened?" she said. "We picked up Holt," Garfield said. 30 minutes ago, eastbound on Route 9. He was in a car with Devin Marsh." He paused. "He wasn't being taken somewhere. He was going voluntarily. He had a go bag in the trunk." Emily processed this. "He was running," she said. "He was running." Garfield's voice was even, but tight. "Which means he knows the situation has changed enough that staying wasn't viable. Which means he had communication with Brandt or Marsh after this morning, and someone told him to move." He looked at her. "Both of them are in federal custody now. We're executing search warrants on Holt's office and residence." "And Brandt?" Garfield's expression did the thing again. The thing she had first seen this morning when she told him about the call. "Brandt landed at Ashford City Regional Airport 45 minutes ago," he said. "Private charter. He's in the city." The corridor was bright and empty around them. Somewhere behind them, Osei was in recovery, breathing, carrying information that could dismantle the structure that had sent 4 men with rifles into an emergency room at 3 in the morning. Somewhere in Ashford City, Raymond Brandt, the man whose name had been on the orders Emily had followed in a restricted theater, the man who had watched her for 3 years from behind the comfortable distance of institutional leverage, was in a car or a hotel or a meeting room managing his situation. "Does he know Holt was picked up?" Emily said. "We're operating on the assumption that he does." "Then he knows the drive is in federal custody. He knows Osei survived. He knows Holt and Marsh are both in custody." She thought through it in sequence. "He's out of moves." "He has one left," Garfield said, "which is why I need you to listen to me carefully." She waited. "He called you this morning before any of that happened," Garfield said. "He wanted a private meeting. He wanted to talk about a misunderstanding." He paused. "In 30 minutes, he's going to call you again. And this time he's going to be significantly less diplomatic." Emily looked at him. "How do you know he'll call in 30 minutes? Garfield reached into his jacket pocket and put a phone on the counter beside her. Not her phone. An identical model. "Because we're going to call him first," he said. "From your number. And we're going to tell him you're ready to meet." The corridor light hummed overhead. Emily looked at the phone. "You want to use me as bait," she said. "I want to use the meeting as the last piece of the evidentiary record," Garfield said. "Brandt on tape, in person, attempting to suppress a witness. Combined with the drive, Osei's testimony, and everything in Holt's files, it closes the case completely." He paused. "But I need you to agree to it, voluntarily, because if you don't, I have enough to prosecute without it, and I will. This isn't coercion." She looked at the phone. She thought about 3 years. The night shifts, the invisible labor, the long effort of becoming someone smaller than she was. The performance reviews designed to thin the herd. The name that someone inside her hospital had handed to a man who had once commanded her. She thought about Osei in the recovery bay, breathing carefully around 2 hours of surgical repair. She picked up the phone, and that was when her own phone, the real one, in her pocket, rang. She pulled it out. Unknown number, different from the morning's call. She looked at Garfield. He looked at the phone. She answered. The voice was not the intermediary this time. It was older, military flat, with the specific cadence of a man who had spent decades having people stand at attention when he spoke. "Sergeant Calloway," Raymond Brandt said, "I think we're past the point where your friend Garfield doesn't know we're talking, so let's skip the parts where we pretend otherwise." Emily said nothing. "I'm going to give you a number," Brandt said. "You're going to come alone to that address in 1 hour, and we're going to have a conversation that determines how the next 48 hours go for everyone involved, including you." A pause. including the people in that hospital who treated your colleagues tonight, and who I can make very comfortable or very uncomfortable depending on how this conversation goes. Emily's hand was steady on the phone. Garfield was watching her face. Brant gave the address and said, 1 hour, Sergeant. And then, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once expected the people below him to refuse, don't make me ask twice. The call ended. Emily lowered the phone and looked at Garfield. Garfield's jaw was tight. We heard it, he said. He meant the surveillance. He meant they had it. Emily, we can't let you go to that address. We don't know what he has, who he has with him. I know, she said. Then you know we need to do this a different... I know, she said again. But I'm going. Garfield stared at her. He called me Sergeant, Emily said. He used the rank, not the name, the rank, which means he's not trying to manage me anymore. She looked at Garfield with the full steadiness she had available, which was considerable. He's trying to end this, and the only way to end it completely, not partially, not on paper, but completely, is if I'm in that room when he tries. Garfield was quiet for 3 seconds. We wire you, he said. Yes, a full team outside. You don't go past the threshold alone. Agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. What if he's not alone? Emily thought about a man who had flown in on a private charter after his network had already started collapsing. A man making calls with a voice trained on compliance. A man who had watched from a distance for 3 years because the distance felt safe, and now the distance was gone. Then we deal with that, she said. But even as she said it, the thing she was not saying, the thing she was holding carefully at the edge of her awareness, not looking at directly, was this. Brant had given an address. She knew Ashford City. She knew the Eastern Grid, the street she had driven for 3 years on her way to and from the hospital. She had run the route in her head the moment he said it. The address was not a hotel. It was not a meeting room. It was a medical supply warehouse on the edge of the industrial corridor, 3 blocks from Riverside Medical Center. He had chosen a location 3 blocks from her hospital, either because he knew the terrain, because Holt had given him a map of everything, the building, the neighborhood, all of it, or because he wanted her to know that nothing in her life here was outside his reach. Either way, it meant something, and what it meant made her stomach do the thing it had not done all night, through the gunfire and the corridors and the surgery. For the first time since 3:17 a.m., Emily Carter was genuinely afraid. The fear lasted approximately 90 seconds. Emily knew this because she tracked it, not to suppress it, but because fear had a useful information content if you didn't let it run past its signal into noise. The fear said, this man has resources and reach, and he chose a location that communicates control. That was accurate. The fear said, you are tired, injured, and operating on no sleep after the most physically demanding night of the last 3 years. That was also accurate. The fear said, something about this is not right in a way you cannot yet name. That last part was the useful part. She stayed with it. Garfield was already on his radio. He had a team that could position around the warehouse in 20 minutes, he said. Plain clothes, vehicles already in the industrial corridor. He wanted Emily wired before she left the hospital. He wanted the approach timed, the exits covered, a code phrase established that would bring the team through the door in under 30 seconds. What's the code phrase? She asked. Your call. Something you'd say naturally but wouldn't say otherwise. She thought for a moment. 17. He looked at her. If I say 17 in any context, you come in, she said. It won't come up naturally in a conversation, but it's short enough that I can work it in fast. He nodded. Wrote it down. And if you lose the wire, then you monitor the entry points and come in at 10 minutes regardless. She met his eyes. Don't wait for the phrase if you lose signal. We won't. The wire was a small adhesive transmitter, the kind that had gotten significantly less cinematic over the years. No elaborate harness, no visible equipment, just a flat disc the size of a quarter that Garfield's tech agent pressed against the inside of her left forearm, under the gauze dressing over her laceration. She could feel it against her skin, faintly warm. Voss appeared in the corridor as Emily was putting her jacket back on. She had changed into civilian clothes, blazer, and dark pants, and she looked at Emily with the expression of someone who had opinions about the plan and had expressed them to Garfield and been overruled. "You don't have to do this," Voss said. "I know. We have enough without it. The drive, OC's testimony once he can speak, Holt's communication records, Marsh in custody. We can build the case." "You can build a case," Emily said. "Brandt will fight every piece of it. He has lawyers who have been building his defense since before this operation started. He'll spend 4 years in proceedings and come out with reduced charges and a story about a decorated officer being targeted by an overreaching federal investigation." She zipped the jacket. "I've seen what happens when people with his resources fight federal charges when the case is built on documents and informants." She looked at Voss. "I want him on tape, in person, telling me what he thinks he can offer and what he thinks he can threaten. I want the jury to hear his voice saying it." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've thought about this kind of accountability for a long time." Emily didn't answer that. She walked toward the exit. The industrial corridor on Ashford City's eastern edge was a holdover from the manufacturing era. Long blocks of warehouse and light industry, most of it converted or abandoned, the kind of neighborhood that looked like it was always between things, never quite arriving at whatever it was supposed to become. The medical supply warehouse was 3 stories of brick and frosted glass, the kind of building that could hold a dozen people or none without looking different from the outside. Emily drove herself. Garfield had objected, and she had explained briefly that arriving with a federal escort or in a monitored vehicle would tell Brandt's people everything they needed to know within 30 seconds. She drove her own car, the same used Civic she had owned for 2.5 years, which she knew every sound of and trusted in the way you trusted something that had never given you a reason not to. She parked on the street, not in the lot. Old habit. She wanted the exit behind her to be hers. A man was waiting at the warehouse's side entrance. Not Brandt, not anyone she recognized, a security type in plain clothes who looked at her car and then at her and opened the door without speaking. Professional. Brandt had brought at least one person, possibly more. She noted the man's posture, the jacket that was a half size too large on the right side, and filed it. The interior was what she'd expected. High ceilings, concrete floors, rows of industrial shelving half-stocked with boxed medical equipment. The loading dock to her right shuttered. Overhead lighting that hit the concrete floor at an angle that created a lot of shadow around the perimeter and a bright open space in the center, near a folding table and 2 chairs that had been set up with the particular intentionality of someone who wanted the meeting to look controlled. Raymond Brandt was standing beside the table. He was 61, she knew from the file, but he carried it the way military men often did when they had stayed in shape. The body still disciplined, the posture still the product of 40 years of having it matter. Silver hair, close cropped, a dark jacket over a collared shirt. He looked at Emily the way people looked at something they had been thinking about for a long time and were now finally seeing in front of them. "Sergeant Calloway," he said. "Carter," she said. "That's my name now." He gestured to the chair across from him, and she did not sit, and he registered this with a small adjustment of his expression. "I'm not going to waste your time," Brandt said. "You're wired. I expect Garfield has vehicles on 3 sides of this building. We both know how this looks from the outside." He sat down himself, slowly, which she recognized as a performance of calm. "What I want to do is talk to you before the machinery takes over completely, because once that happens, neither of us controls the narrative." "You lost the narrative when Osei survived," Emily said. Something crossed his face, a fast contraction, quickly controlled. "Osei is a federal informant with a history of criminal association who got shot by his own organization. His testimony will be contested. His credibility is supported by an encrypted drive with 6 years of financial records and your name on a payment structure," Emily said, "and by Richard Holt, who was picked up on Route 9 this morning and who is currently explaining his relationship with Devin Marsh to 2 federal agents in a room that is considerably less comfortable than this one." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. She counted. Brandt looked at her. "Holt was picked up about 2 hours ago." He absorbed this. She watched him do it, the recalculation, the inventory of what Holt knew and would say, and how fast he would say it. She had seen this face before, in the field, on people whose plans had run into reality. The expression always looked the same, the architecture of the certainty showing through the surface as it cracked. "I'll be direct," he said finally. "You've been direct," Emily said. "You've been direct since you called me sergeant this morning. You're trying to establish dominance before you make the offer. Skip to the offer." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, something in his posture shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting. The recognition of someone recalibrating their approach when the first approach hadn't landed. "The after-action reports from your second tour," he said, "your medical assessments. If those documents become part of the public evidentiary record, questions will be raised about your role in operations that involve civilian casualties. The questions will be answered. You were following orders, your assessments were accurate, none of it comes back to you legally. But the process of answering those questions takes time. It involves your name in proceedings. It involves a version of your history that you came here to leave behind." He paused. "I can make those documents disappear. Completely. Your record stays sealed. You stay Emily Carter. Nobody in Ashford City ever knows your other name." Emily said nothing. "In exchange," Brandt said, "you give a statement to a federal oversight board, not Garfield's team, a separate body, attesting that your medical assessments during the relevant operations were incomplete due to situational limitations, that the accuracy of those reports as evidence of command decisions is compromised by the conditions under which they were filed." He held her eyes. "You don't have to lie. You just have to introduce doubt, the kind of doubt that makes those reports inconclusive rather than damning." The warehouse was very quiet. Somewhere in the building's upper structure, something was moving. Pigeons or ventilation, a low mechanical sound that rose and fell. Emily looked at the table between them. She thought about the 3 soldiers whose deaths she had documented in those reports. She remembered their names. She remembered all of them, in the specific way that names from that kind of context lived in you permanently, not as grief exactly, but as a weight that became familiar enough to carry. She thought about what it would mean to introduce doubt into the record of how they died. "No," she said. Brandt looked at her. "No," she said again. "That's the answer. It was always going to be the answer." He sat back slightly. "You understand what You're asking me to protect you by contaminating the record of what happened to people who died because of your decisions." She kept her voice level because the anger underneath it was not useful in this room right now. "You've mistaken me for someone who came here to negotiate." "Then why did you come?" he said. 17, she said. Odd. The door came open fast. 3 agents, tactical gear, and Garfield behind them, and Brandt's security man in the outer room was already on the floor, hands behind his head, handled so quickly that Emily had only heard the start of the commotion before the interior team was through. Brandt stood up from the chair. Not panicked, she noted this. He stood up with the deliberate quality of a man who had decided where the dignity was and was going there. "I want my attorney," he said. "You can call from federal custody," Garfield said. He was beside Emily now, and he looked at her with a question that wasn't a question. "Got everything you need," she said. She walked out through the side door and stood in the industrial corridor in the thin morning light and breathed. The next several hours moved in the particular rhythm of institutional process, the rhythm that felt slow after everything else had moved so fast. Federal holding, search warrants executed on Brandt's hotel room and the charter aircraft, the seizure of 3 phones and a laptop that Brandt's attorney arrived to object to approximately 40 minutes too late, the processing of Holt and Marsh, the formal declaration of Victor Osei as a protected federal witness issued from a hospital room where he was still 40% sedated but had managed to confirm his identity to 2 agents, which was apparently sufficient. Emily sat in a federal interview room for 2 hours and gave a formal statement that was thorough and accurate and left nothing out, including the offer Brandt had made, in detail with the wire recording as support. The federal attorney present across the table had the expression of someone watching a case consolidate in real time. She drove back to the hospital at 4 in the afternoon because she didn't know where else to go. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 10 minutes. The lot was still half filled with federal vehicles, though the cordon around the entrance had come down. Through the glass face of the lobby, she could see movement, the normal movement of a hospital continuing, people coming and going with the patient traffic of a regular afternoon, the building absorbing what had happened to it and moving on because that was what buildings and institutions did. She got out of the car and went inside. Barbara Okonkwo was at the nursing station when Emily came through the corridor, and she looked up with the expression of someone who had been waiting but was trying not to make it obvious. "You should be sleeping," Barbara said. "Later." Emily sat down in the chair at the end of the station. Her body was registering the hours now in the particular way of total exhaustion, the deep cellular kind, where individual muscles sent their own separate grievances. The laceration on her forearm throbbed steadily. "What's happening?" Barbara said. Not to the room. To Emily. Emily looked at the station counter for a moment. "They arrested the man who was behind the network, the ones who came in last night." She paused. "And the person who was providing them with information about the hospital." Barbara was very still. "Who?" "Holt." The quiet that followed was dense. Barbara set down the clipboard she had been holding. She looked at the middle distance for a moment, processing, and Emily watched her go through what 3 years of working under that administration felt like, with this new information layered over it. "That explains some things," Barbara said finally, in the tone of someone who had known something was wrong and had never been able to name it. "Yes," Emily said, "it does." Dr. Whitfield came around the corner with a patient chart and stopped when he saw Emily. He had the look of a man who had been thinking about something for several hours and had arrived at something he needed to say. "You're back," he said. "I'm back." He set the chart on the counter. He looked at her with the particular discomfort of someone who was not practiced at this kind of accountability and was doing it anyway because it had become unavoidable. "I owe you more than what I said this morning," he said. "The apology I offered it was insufficient. It addressed tonight without addressing the 3 years before tonight, which is where the actual problem was." He paused. "I've been dismissive, consistently. I've corrected you publicly when you were right and when you were wrong, without distinguishing between the two, because it didn't occur to me to consider that the distinction mattered to you." He said it plainly, without decoration. "I was wrong." Emily looked at him. She could have been gracious. She could have absolved him cleanly and moved on because she was tired and because it would have been easier for both of them. She said, "I filed 3 patient escalation reports in the last year that your name was on, cases where my assessment was overridden and the patient outcome supported my original assessment. None of those reports were acknowledged." Whitfield held her gaze. "I know. I'd like those cases reviewed formally, through the Quality Review Board." She kept her voice even. "Not to prosecute anybody, because the outcomes involved real patients and the system should learn from them." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll initiate it," he said. "Personally." She nodded once. He picked up his chart and walked back toward the patient rooms, and Emily could see in the set of his shoulders that this wasn't over for him, that he was going to carry it for a while, and that this was appropriate. The formal disclosure happened at 6:15 that evening in a conference room on the 3rd floor that had been requisitioned by the federal team for the notification process. Garfield ran it, with Voss beside him and a JAG representative Emily hadn't met before. The hospital's acting operations director, Holt's second-in-command, a cautious man named Ferretti who had apparently been trying to reach Holt all day without knowing why, sat on the other side of the table. Garfield laid it out in order. The Larson Group, the network, the 11-month investigation. Osei, the 4 men who had entered the ER, Holt's role as an internal source, the 6 months of structured intelligence he had provided to Marsh, the facilitation of Osei's placement at Riverside as a managed asset, and Emily, her actual service record, her unit designation, her commendations, her role in the events of the previous night, laid out in the flat factual language of a federal briefing. Ferretti listened to all of it without speaking. He was an accountant by training, Emily had heard, which meant he processed information in the sequence it was presented and did not interrupt. When Garfield finished, Ferretti looked at Emily for a long time. "You have been employed here for 3 years, he said. "Yes." "During which time Richard Holt—" He stopped, started again. during which time the person ostensibly responsible for your employment was actively working against your interests and against the security of this hospital. Among other things, Emily said. Ferretti looked at the table. He looked like a man who had walked into a meeting expecting a difficult quarter-end review and discovered he was in a completely different building. I want to be clear, he said finally, that the hospital's position, my position, is that what you did last night was not a liability for this institution. It was the reason this institution still has patients in its beds and staff going home to their families. He said this carefully because he was a careful person, but he meant it, and Emily could hear that he meant it. I don't know what the right way to say this is. You don't have to say it, Emily said. I think I do. He paused. We failed you. The system here failed you, repeatedly, and some of that was Holt, and some of it was institutional culture that has nothing to do with Holt, and I'm not able to address all of it tonight, but I want you to know that I see it. Emily looked at him. She thought about 3 years of night shifts, the form letter response to her staffing complaint, the performance review metrics that had her name on them with the implicit threat underneath. The staffing review, she said, the one Holt initiated 4 months ago. Canceled, Ferretti said. As of this afternoon. She nodded. It wasn't everything. It wasn't close to everything. But it was the beginning of a different kind of accounting, and she could feel the difference between the two. She found Marcus Teal in the break room at 7 p.m., restocking the supply cart he had been working on when she'd given him the gloves 12 hours ago. He looked up when she came in and did the thing he kept doing, the attempt to reconcile what he'd seen with the person standing in front of him. They're saying things on the news, he said. She hadn't seen the news. She had been deliberately avoiding it. What kind of things? The federal arrest, the network. They're not using your name. They're calling you a hospital employee. But, he paused. People here know, and the news said it was a nurse who... He stopped. People are talking. Emily got a cup of water from the sink. Let them talk. Doesn't that bother you? She thought about this honestly. 3 years of invisible labor, of being filed away as competent enough and unremarkable, of her assessments going unacknowledged, of her name on incident reports that nobody read. 3 years of smaller and smaller because smaller felt like safety. Parts of it, she said. The parts that bother me are the ones I'll figure out. She looked at him. The parts that don't bother me are bigger than the parts that do. Marcus nodded, working through this. Then he said, Can I ask you something? You can try. When you were in those corridors last night, were you scared? She thought about the honest answer. At the end, she said, When I went to meet Brant this morning, that scared me. Not the guys with the guns? The guys with the guns were a problem I could see, she said. Brant was a problem I'd been living next to for 3 years without knowing it. Those are different kinds of fear. He thought about this. That's a real answer. She finished the water. The supply cart needs the IV sets restocked. 3rd shelf, bins on the right. He turned back to the cart, almost smiling. Voss found her in the corridor at 8 that evening, heading for the exit. Brant's attorney filed for an emergency bail hearing, Voss said, falling into step beside her. It was denied. She paused. The wire recording is being processed into the formal evidentiary file. Along with the drive content, Holt's statement. He started talking approximately 2 hours after he was brought in, which is not surprising given that Marsh was talking in the next room, and Osai's preliminary statement, which he gave at 5:30 this afternoon. 38 minutes from a hospital bed with a federal recorder on his IV stand. She paused again. He named Brant by name 11 times. Emily pushed the door open. The night air came in cooler than the morning, carrying the smell of rain somewhere in the distance. How long until charges are filed? She said. For Brant? Formally, within 48 hours. His attorney will contest everything, but the evidentiary position is... Voss paused, and something in her voice shifted slightly, the professional flatness giving way to something underneath it. It's complete. That's the word I'd use. The case is complete. Emily stood at the threshold of the door. The parking lot was quieter now, fewer federal vehicles, the lot returning to its normal pattern of overnight workers' cars, and the ambulance bay lit steady white. "There's something else," Voss said. Emily looked at her. "Your sealed file," Voss said. "The Army record. As part of the proceeding, it's going to be unsealed for evidentiary purposes. Your actual service record, the commendations, the operational classifications, the unit designation, the full after-action documentation." She held Emily's eyes. "People are going to know who you are, not the filtered version, the real version." The night air moved between them. Emily had been holding this possibility at the edge of her awareness since Garfield had used her other name in the dark corridor at 4 a.m, holding it out at arm's length because the implications of it were large and she hadn't had the space to look at them fully. She looked at them now. 3 years of careful small living. 3 years of being Emily Carter, night shift nurse, invisible and contained. 3 years of believing that if she got small enough, the past would stop being able to find her. It had found her anyway. It had always been going to find her. "Okay," she said. Voss looked at her. "Just okay?" "Just okay," Emily said. "I'm tired of carrying it sideways. Let it be what it is." Voss nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else and was deciding against it. She said it anyway. "The after-action reports, the ones from the restricted tour, the JAG team reviewed them today." She paused. "All 3 of them. Your assessments were accurate. Your documentation was accurate. There is nothing in those reports that reflects anything except a medical specialist doing her job correctly under extremely difficult conditions." She held Emily's eyes. "That's the official assessment, in writing, filed as part of the proceeding." Emily said nothing for a moment. The weight she had been carrying, not the grief which would stay, but the weight of not knowing whether the record reflected the truth, shifted. Not gone. Shifted. "Thank you," she said. She walked toward her car. She was halfway across the parking lot when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Different from Brandt's intermediary, different from the morning calls. A federal number, she thought from the prefix. She opened it. The message had no text, just a photograph. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was a hospital room, not Riverside. The room configuration was different, a different institution, the bed positioned against the wrong wall, a patient in the bed, male, older, connected to monitors. She recognized the face. It was the face from the after-action reports. Not a soldier, not Osei, not Brandt. A man she had last seen 11 years ago in a forward operating base in a classified theater, a man who had been listed as killed in action 14 months after she left the unit, whose death she had seen the report for, whose name was in the same sealed file that had just been unsealed. He was alive. And at the bottom of the photograph, in a text that had no context and no signature, were 6 words. "He's been talking. You need to know." She stood in the parking lot for a long time looking at the photograph. The monitors in the background were the kind she knew. She had worked with enough hospital equipment across enough context to read them the way other people read road signs. The waveforms visible on the nearest screen told her the patient was stable, cardiac rhythm regular, oxygenation acceptable. Whoever had sent this had not sent it as a death notification. They had sent it as evidence of something living. Sergeant First Class Daniel Rourke, that was the name. She had not said it aloud in 4 years, and she said it now, quietly, to the empty parking lot, because some things needed to be spoken to become real in the right direction. Rourke had been her senior medic on the first restricted deployment. He had been the person who taught her the field triage system she still used, the one she had adapted for civilian nursing in ways that her colleagues found unusually instinctive. He had been killed in action 14 months after her separation. That was what the report said. She had received the notification through unofficial channels, a former colleague who still had access to unit communications, and she had sat with it for a week and then put it in the place where she put things she couldn't change. 14 months after her separation. Which meant approximately 2.5 years ago. Which meant the report had been false for 2.5 years, and someone had known, and the photograph in her hand had been sent from a federal number, and the 6 words at the bottom meant that Rourke had been somewhere, talking, and that whatever he had been saying was connected to what was happening tonight. She called the number back. It rang 4 times. Then a voice she recognized. Not the voice in the photograph, but the voice of Major Voss, who had apparently been 20 feet away in the parking lot when the text arrived and had anticipated exactly this call. "Where is he?" Emily said. "St. Carver Regional Medical Center in Dunmore," Voss said. 2 hours north. A pause. "He came in 3 days ago under a false name, chest trauma, secondary infection. He's been stable since yesterday." Another pause, shorter. "He presented to federal authorities voluntarily 48 hours ago, through a back channel, not official, someone he trusted outside the system. He had been living under a protected identity that Brandt arranged 11 years ago." Emily's hand tightened on the phone. "Brandt arranged it," she said. "Rourke had documentation of operational decisions that predated everything on the drive. Direct eyewitness testimony, not filtered through medical reports. He was going to be a liability, so Brandt made him disappear instead of killing him. Cleaner, fewer questions." Voss's voice was even, but not entirely flat. "He's been living quietly in 3 different states for 11 years. He came forward because he heard about the Osei situation through the network he'd been monitoring from the outside. He was monitoring it. He never stopped trying to find a way to surface what he knew. He just couldn't find a path that didn't end with him dead." Voss paused. "He can now." Emily looked at the hospital behind her, the lights in the upper floors, the steady white of the ambulance bay, the building continuing its long work of keeping people alive. She thought about what it meant to disappear because someone powerful needed your silence, to lose your own name and your own story, and spend 11 years trying to find a way back into the record. She knew something about that. Not the same thing, but something. "I want to see him," she said. "I know," Voss said. "That's why I sent the photo." Pass. She drove north on the interstate with the windows down because she needed the air and the noise and the specific sensation of movement after a day of being in rooms. The drive was 2 hours, and she used the first hour to let the silence do what silence does when you have run out of the capacity to process anything actively. She let it sit, let the road go under her, let the radio play something she wasn't listening to, and when the first hour was done, she was still exhausted, but she was a different kind of exhausted, the kind that had passed through itself into something functional. She thought about Rourke in the second hour. She thought about the specific texture of working beside someone in conditions that stripped everything non-essential away. No rank performance, no professional posturing, just 2 people trying to keep other people alive under pressure, which was the most honest form of collaboration she had ever found in any context. She thought about the day she had left the unit, the handshake in the FOB command tent, his face doing the thing faces did when someone was saying goodbye in a way that might be permanent without anyone wanting to name it. She had not let herself think about him since the notification. That was the deal she had made. You could not carry everyone. You carried the work. She arrived at St. Carver Regional at 20 past 10. It was a mid-sized hospital, newer than Riverside, with a parking structure that worked and overhead lighting that didn't flicker. There was a federal agent at the entrance to the 4th floor who checked her ID and made a call and let her through. The room was at the end of the corridor. She stood outside it for a moment, not hesitating, just giving herself the beat before the door opened on something she had categorized as finished. She knocked and went in. Rourke was propped up in the bed at about 40 degrees, which was the position you used when you wanted the patient upright enough to be alert, but not upright enough to stress the chest. He was thinner than she remembered, with the particular leanness of someone who had been sick recently, and before that had been living carefully. His hair had gone mostly gray. There was a drainage tube at his left side that explained the posture. His eyes, when they found her across the room, were the same. Alert, evaluating, the specific gaze of someone who had never fully stopped doing threat assessment, even in a hospital bed. "Carter," he said. "Rourke." They looked at each other. 11 years, a false death, a sealed file, and one night in Ashford City that had cracked open everything. It was too much weight for any particular sentence to carry, and they were both people who understood this, so they didn't try to make a sentence carry it. "You look terrible," he said. "I haven't slept," she said. "You look like you have a chest drain." "I do." He glanced down at it with mild annoyance. 3 more days, they say. She pulled the chair from the corner and sat beside the bed. She looked at his chart on the wall monitor out of habit, the occupational reflex of a nurse who read patient data the way other people read the room. Stable, genuinely stable. "How much do you know?" she asked. "About tonight?" "Most of it. I've been getting briefings since Osei surfaced 2 days ago." He paused. "They told me about the 4 men, about what you did." She said nothing. "I'm not surprised," he said. "You were always the one who stayed functional." "I'm not always functional," she said. "I've spent 3 years being as small as possible." "I know." He said it with the particular weight of someone who understood the mechanism from the inside. "I spent 11 years being invisible. It's not the same as functional. It just looks like it from the outside." He shifted slightly against the pillows, careful of the drain. "I should have found a way to surface this sooner. I know that. I've known it for years. You were trying to stay alive." "I was," he said. "But there were 3 men who died on those operations whose families still have incomplete records. I carried that." He looked at her directly. "You carried it too, in your reports, which is why Brandt needed them buried." "They're not buried anymore," she said. "No." He held her gaze. "They're not." Rourke's formal testimony to the federal investigation took 4 sessions over the following 2 days, conducted at his bedside with a federal recorder and 2 attorneys present. Emily was not in the room for the testimony. She had her own proceedings to manage, but Voss relayed the substance of it in the structured way of someone managing information flow carefully. Rourke had direct eyewitness testimony covering 6 operational decisions made by Brandt's command between 11 and 13 years ago. 3 of those decisions had resulted in soldier deaths that were attributed to enemy action in the official record, but had in fact been the result of Brandt overriding field medical assessments, including Emily's, and ordering tactical movements that the medical team had flagged as incompatible with the physical conditions of the personnel involved. Rourke had been present for all 3. He had documented them in personal notes that he had been carrying for 11 years in a waterproof case that went with him through 3 states and a false identity and a chest infection. The notes were authenticated. The timeline matched Emily's medical records. The combined documentation, Garfield's lead attorney told Emily in a brief call on the second morning, was the kind of evidentiary convergence that made defense attorneys go quiet in their chairs. Brandt's attorney filed 4 motions in the first 48 hours. All 4 were denied. On the 3rd day, Brandt was formally charged. 3 counts of negligent homicide under military jurisdiction, conspiracy to obstruct federal investigation, witness intimidation, and criminal association with the Larson Group. Theodore Larson himself, reached at a property in Connecticut where he had apparently been waiting to see how the situation resolved, was taken into federal custody on the same day. The Larson Group's financial infrastructure was frozen within hours of the charges filing. Accounts across 4 jurisdictions locked by court order, while investigators mapped the full network. Richard Holt, in exchange for a cooperation agreement, provided a complete account of his 18 months of intelligence feeding to Devon Marsh. His account named 3 additional hospital administrators in 2 other cities who had been running similar arrangements with Larson Group affiliates, a detail that expanded the investigation in ways that would take months to fully trace. Holt received a reduced charge. He would not work in hospital administration again. Marsh received no such agreement. He had tried to negotiate and had been found to be withholding material information during the negotiation, which ended the conversation. Victor Osei, recovering steadily in a monitored room at Riverside, gave his full testimony on the 4th day. 38 minutes had become 3 hours across 2 sessions, and the federal attorney who conducted the sessions described his account as simply exhaustive. Osei had been doing what he had been doing for 11 months for reasons that were partly self-preservation and partly something else, a kind of moral accounting that had apparently begun when he had watched the network do something to someone he knew that he could not set aside. Emily never learned the specific details of that. Some things about why people finally decide to tell the truth were private, and she respected the privacy of them. She was back at Riverside on the 6th day, not on shift. She wasn't scheduled until the following week, and Ferretti had told her twice that there was no urgency, that she should take the time she needed, in the careful way of an administrator who had recently learned that his institution had failed an employee significantly and was now overcompensating in the direction of consideration. She had nodded and thanked him and come back anyway, because the hospital was where she knew how to be. The ER was quieter than normal for a Tuesday afternoon. Word had gotten around in the way that word always got around in a city of this size, and some of the discretionary traffic had shifted to Mercy General for the week. This would normalize. Hospitals were resilient in this specific way. People got sick regardless of what had happened in the building, and need was a stronger force than discomfort. Barbara was at the nursing station. She looked up when Emily came in and did not say anything for a moment, just looked at her in the way of someone taking a full inventory. "You slept," Barbara said. "Some." "You look less like a person who's been in a car crash." "Thank you," Emily said. "I think." She sat at the end of the station. The familiar sounds of the ER settled around her. Monitors, the soft percussion of equipment moving on linoleum, a conversation between two residents in the corridor about a differential diagnosis that she listened to briefly and had an opinion about and kept to herself. The Quality Review Board, Whitfield had informed her 2 days ago, had scheduled the review of the 3 patient escalation reports she had named. She had received a formal confirmation by email, the language of which was notably careful and notably specific. The kind of language that had been drafted with awareness of what was appropriate, which was itself a change from the form letters of the previous administration. The review would take 6 weeks. She had noted the timeline and moved on. The formal unsealing of her Army record had produced, as Voss had predicted, a period of attention she found uncomfortable. Her full service history, the commendations, the unit designation, the operational record. It had landed in the federal court filings, and from there into the awareness of the journalists covering the Brandt case, and from there into the public record in the particular way that things entered the public record in the current era, fast, partial, and slightly wrong in the details, but roughly accurate in the shape. The shape was decorated combat medic, 6 years of service including classified operations, 3 years as a night shift nurse in Ashford City, 1 night in which she had used everything she had to keep people alive. The shape was accurate. The details she corrected where she could and let go where she couldn't. Dr. Whitfield found her at the station at 3 in the afternoon. He had a coffee, 2 coffees, one of which he held out toward her in the slightly awkward way of a man practicing a gesture he wasn't used to. She took it. "Quality board confirmed," he said. 6 weeks. I'm the requesting physician on all 3 cases. "I know. I got the email." He stood beside the station, not quite at ease, not quite uncomfortable. A man recalibrating, still mid-process. "I talked to the residents this morning," he said, "about public correction, about what it communicates to nursing staff when a physician overrides an assessment in front of patients." He paused. "I used examples, non-specific." Emily looked at him. "That's a better apology than an apology," she said. He considered this. "I thought it might be." He walked back toward the patient rooms. She watched him go, and she thought that people were capable of more revision than they usually attempted, and that the attempt, imperfect, late, visibly uncomfortable, was still worth something. Not everything, but something. Rourke was discharged from St. Carver on day 7. He drove to Ashford City. She had not asked him to, but she was not surprised. And they sat in a diner 3 blocks from the hospital and ate breakfast at 4 in the afternoon because neither of them was operating on a normal schedule. He looked better than the hospital bed. Still thin, still moving carefully around the healing chest, but present in the way of someone who had stopped waiting for the other thing to happen. "They offered me a deposition position," he said. "Consulting with the JAG team on the operational timeline. 6 months, maybe more." "Are you taking it?" "I think so." He turned his coffee cup slowly. "I've been living like I was waiting for permission to exist. I think it's time to stop waiting." Emily looked at her plate. She had ordered eggs and toast because she had not eaten anything resembling a normal meal in a week, and her body had started making its opinions about this known in the persistent way of a body that has been managed rather than listened to. "What about you?" he said. She thought about the question, not the short version of it, the immediate answer, the staying at Riverside answer, but the longer version, the one that was harder to articulate because it involved knowing something that she had spent 3 years unlearning. I've been trying to be smaller than I am, she said. I thought it was survival. It was partly survival. She paused. It was also avoidance. Those aren't the same thing, and I kept treating them like they were. Rourke nodded. I'm staying at Riverside, she said. For now. Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I want to. She thought about Barbara, about Marcus and his nitrile gloves, about the residents in the corridor discussing their differential with the particular energy of people still learning. There's work there that matters. I want to do it as myself, not as the smallest possible version of myself. That's different, he said. Yes, she said. It is. The sentencing outcomes came through in waves over the following 3 months, the judicial process moving at its own pace. Deliberate, bureaucratic, frustratingly slow in the ways that judicial process always was, and then suddenly final. Theodore Larson received 17 years. His attorney had argued the age of his client, who was 67, and the court had acknowledged the argument and imposed 17 years anyway, on the grounds that the age of the victims' families had also been a factor worth considering. Devin Marsh received 12 years. His network connections, the evidence of his placement operations across multiple hospitals, and the direct link to the 4 men who had entered Riverside Medical Center on that night were sufficient for the prosecution's sentencing argument and more than sufficient for the jury's agreement. Raymond Brandt's proceedings were longer, as Emily had expected. The military jurisdiction components ran parallel to the federal civilian charges, and the defense strategy involved contesting every document and every witness in the methodical way of someone who had resources and was going to use them until they ran out. They ran out. The convergence of Rourke's testimony, Emily's medical records, the after-action reports from the unsealed file, and the independent forensic timeline compiled by the JAG team produced a record that the defense could challenge at the margins, but could not challenge at the center. Brandt was convicted on all counts, 19 years, federal and military sentences to run consecutively. His retirement benefits were revoked. His commission was formally stripped. The military ceremony for the stripping was not public, but Voss described it to Emily in a brief message that said only, "It was appropriate." Emily understood what that meant and was satisfied with it. Holt served 14 months under his cooperation agreement before being released to supervise probation. He did not return to Ashford City. Emily knew this not because she was tracking him, but because Barbara mentioned it once and she filed it away. And then she stopped thinking about Holt because he was finished and the space his absence left in her awareness was better filled with other things. Victor Osei, under federal witness protection, was relocated and given access to the vocational and psychological support resources that the protection program provided. Emily did not know his new location. She knew he was alive and had told the truth at considerable personal cost, and she thought about that sometimes. The choice to talk, the particular courage of it, the way it had set other things in motion, and she was grateful in the complicated way you were grateful for something that had also been a catastrophe. Officer Hendricks was discharged from the ICU after 11 days. He walked out of the hospital under his own power, and someone took a photograph of it that circulated on the local news for about a day before being replaced by whatever came next. Emily saw the photograph. He looked like someone who had been through something difficult and was glad to be on the other side of it. She understood the expression well. The formal recognition ceremony happened on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd month, in the hospital's main conference room, which had been rearranged with chairs and a small podium and a table with a framed commendation that Emily had not been told about in advance and would not have requested if she had been asked. Ferretti ran it, with Whitfield beside him, and there were representatives from the city, from the federal task force, and from the Army. A major general named Obi, who had flown in from Washington and who carried himself with the specific gravity of someone who had read Emily's full file and had opinions about how it had been handled. The room had the staff in it, nursing, residents, the administrative people she recognized and the ones she didn't, Marcus Teal in the back row looking like he'd borrowed a button-down shirt for the occasion. Barbara was in the front row, sitting with the stillness of someone who had no intention of crying and would manage this through sheer character. Ferretti spoke about the hospital, about the night, about what it meant for an institution when the people within it exceeded what was asked of them. He was careful and genuinely meant it and spoke for about 4 minutes, which was the right length. Whitfield spoke for 2. He said that the hospital had failed to see clearly and that seeing clearly now did not undo the failure but was the only honest response to it. He said Emily Carter was the best clinician currently on his staff and that this assessment, unlike several of his previous ones, was accurate. He said it into the microphone with the directness of someone who had decided the discomfort of saying it was less important than the fact of it being said. Major General Obi presented the commendation citation. Not a new one, but the original commendation from Emily's second tour, which had been classified along with the rest of her file and was now declassified and printed and framed and legible, the language of it specific about what she had done and under what conditions. He did not editorialize. He read it. Then he said, Sergeant First Class Calloway served this country with a standard of courage and competence that this Army does not always deserve and does not always recognize in time. We are recognizing it now. He paused. Better late than never is a low bar. But here we are. It got a small surprised laugh from the room, which Emily thought was the right note. She stood at the podium and looked out at the room and did not prepare what she was going to say, because prepared remarks felt like a different occasion than this one. I spent a long time trying to be invisible, she said. I thought if I was small enough, everything I'd been before would stop being relevant. That didn't work. She paused. It turns out you don't get to choose which parts of yourself to bring into a room. You bring all of it, whether you mean to or not. She looked at the people in front of her, the people she had worked beside for 3 years, who had not known her and who were knowing her now, which was uncomfortable and also right. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to keep people alive. That's what I was trained to do, and it's what I do here every night. And those two things are not as separate as I spent 3 years pretending they were. She looked at Marcus in the back row, who was nodding with the earnestness of someone who had asked her a question in a kitchenette and was hearing the full version of the answer. I'm still just a nurse on the night shift, she said. I'm going to keep being that, but I'm going to stop apologizing for everything else that comes with it. She stepped back from the podium. The room responded the way rooms responded when something true had been said plainly, not with a performance of emotion, but with a particular quality of attention, the kind that meant it had landed. She was at the triage station at 11:30 that night, blood pressure cuff in hand, fluorescent lights humming their usual note above her. The waiting room was doing what waiting rooms did. A man with a laceration on his palm filling out paperwork with his good hand. A woman with a child on her lap, the child listing sideways towards sleep. An older man in the corner watching his phone with the focused attention of someone whose alternative was thinking about why he was there. Marcus came around from the supply corridor with a restocked cart and stopped beside the station. Quiet night, he said. Don't say that, she said. He almost smiled. Sorry. Habit. She looked at the waiting room. The particular ordinary suffering of it, the people bringing their broken and bleeding and frightened selves to a place that would try to help, which was the oldest and most reliable thing a hospital did, the thing that didn't change regardless of what happened in the corridors. She thought about Rourke, starting his JAG consulting work this week, carrying his 11 years of documentation into rooms where it would finally mean something. She thought about Voss back in Washington, running the next operation, whatever it was. She thought about the 3 soldiers in the after-action reports, whose families now had accurate records and accurate knowledge of how their deaths had happened, not comfort, but truth, which was what the record owed them and had owed them for a long time. She thought about the night, 3 months ago, when she had stood in this same spot with a blood pressure cuff in her hand and 4 men with rifles had come through the doors, and she had made a choice that she had not consciously made so much as recognized. The recognition that you could spend years trying to put distance between yourself and what you were capable of, and the distance would not hold when it needed to. The distance had not held. She was not sorry. There was something the Army had taught her that nursing had reinforced, and that the last 3 months had made undeniable, that the thing standing between a person and total catastrophe was almost never an institution or a system or a protocol. It was almost always a specific human being who showed up with everything they had and refused to do less than they were capable of. That person was usually overlooked until they weren't. That person was usually underpaid and under-resourced and working a night shift in a building that needed a new parking garage. That person was almost never recognized until the moment the recognition could no longer be withheld. She had spent 3 years being that person in the invisible version. She would spend the next years being that person in the visible version. The only difference was she had stopped pretending the two were separate. The waiting room doors opened. A paramedic team came through with a gurney, fast, and Emily set down the blood pressure cuff and moved toward the incoming patient, and the ER opened around her like a familiar language, and she went to work. Months. Some people spend their whole lives making themselves smaller to survive in spaces that were never designed for them. They learn to work around systems instead of through them. They file accurate reports. Nobody reads and correct assessments. Nobody acknowledges and carry their capabilities like something to be ashamed of. The truth those people carry doesn't disappear because it's ignored. It waits. And when the moment comes, as it always eventually comes, the question isn't whether they have what it takes. The question is whether they've been allowed to know it about themselves. Emily Carter always had what it took. She just stopped pretending she didn't.